math is correct. And we've been tracing, John, we have been tracing the political history that took place in Israel and related areas of that part of the world, kind of beginning with the end of the Persian Empire, okay? Basically when Alexander the Great started his thing in around 330 BC. The Persians, of course, are in charge when the Old Testament closes. And then when you open up the New Testament, 400 some odd years later, Rome's in charge. And you think, well, how did we get here? Okay. I want us to pause for a moment and appreciate just how much history passed in those 400 years. And to put it in perspective, I want you to imagine that you backed up 450 years into the past and then jumped to today. Okay, 450 years ago, there's been no settlement in America by Europeans, all right? And you jump today and you're like, wow, how did we get here? Okay, that's a pretty significant. There's barely any American settlers in Oregon. The Oregon Trail thing hasn't started even 200 years ago. So if you think about everything that's taken place across the world in the last 450 years, have things changed a little bit? Okay, I mean, you're missing 2 world wars. You're missing the entire, filling out of the continent of North America and South America by Europeans, and on. You've got, atomic energy and nuclear weapons, and 450 years ago, they're still riding horseback, and now we got tanks and cars, and we even have electric cars now, and who knows, in like 30 years, we're going to be zooming around like the Jetsons on that cartoon years ago. So there's a lot of history that has passed, and we've been going through the history. We talked about in the first lesson kind of Alexander the Great and the beginning of the Greek kingdom, how it divided into 2 parts. You had the Seleucids in the north in Syria, you had the Ptolemies in the south in Egypt, and Palestine's just constantly caught in between. They're bouncing back and forth. Then we looked at Daniel 11 and how that chapter contains so many specific prophecies that we kind of saw historically how they came true. And then we started looking at the Maccabean period. We looked at the lead up to the Maccabean revolt in the mid 160s BC. And then last week we looked at how the Maccabeans really became known as the Hasmonean Dynasty. We looked at how the Hasmonean Dynasty really reigned over Israel down to around 100 BC, 103 BC to be exact. That's where we left off last week. And what we're going to discover, so we actually have some videos to watch tonight about that historical period. And I'm going to use these videos as an experiment to see if these are helpful versus me just telling the story to the best of my ability. But I'm going to give you the quick overview of what happens in these videos, just real briefly in a nutshell. The Hasmonean dynasty will die out or come to an ignoble end about 40 years after our story tonight begins. And what has happened in that area of the world, and this has involved the Syrians, the Seleucids, this has involved the Egyptians and the Ptolemies, but it's also been true of the Hasmoneans in Israel. They started having a lot of internal strife and friction. Factions began, and everybody's basically in and out of civil war, okay? Ptolemies got their internal problems, the Seleucids have their internal problems, and the Maccabeans, the Hasmoneans, have their own internal problems, and they just start squabbling with each other. Well, what's going to happen when it comes to national strength and cohesion? What's going to happen in that entire region if everybody's got internal squabbles and civil war that they're constantly sorting out and putting down? What's going to happen?
They're vulnerable.
Yeah, they're going to destabilize and they're going to become very vulnerable. And Rome transitions from being the power broker in that part of the world. Like I said last week, they're the ones that kind of go, all right, everybody to their corner, go time out, stand in the corner, think about what you did. They go from that to they just start running roughshod over everybody and accumulating these areas as provinces, okay? And that's what eventually happens to Israel. So one, we're going to see how Rome enters the picture, and at the end of today's story, they are the dominant power, the ruling power in Judea, and they will not give that up, obviously, until after Jerusalem is completely destroyed, and the end of Judaism as we know it comes to an end in AD 70, some 130 years after they first took rule. The other thing, though, that you're going to see happen during this period, and I've talked about how that the Sadducees and the Pharisees came about. During this period, their split becomes even more and more and more and more and more pronounced. The wedge between them becomes larger and larger and larger. You also see the forerunner of the Jewish Sanhedrin form. It was the Jewish Senate, okay? And the Jewish Senate has been kind of a legal body, if you will, and they're going to take on a more prominent role when they evolve into the Sanhedrin Council that we read about in the New Testament. The Sanhedrin Council was made up of both Sadducees and Pharisees. It started out with the Jewish Senate, that these were priests and other individuals that were pretty much qualified elders of the people to sit on the Sanhedrin. But during this period, the Jewish Senate, later the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Senate, instead of having elders of the people sitting in this body in a judicial role, it becomes very political, and so anybody that can basically buy a seat is sitting on the Sanhedrin. Does that make sense? Because so it went from older men that are, they've distinguished themselves and they're respected in their communities, and they all come together for judicial purposes. It goes to people just buy seats. It becomes very political, kind of like our Congress. All right. So you have that evolution, and of course we read about the Sanhedrin Council in the New Testament. They're the ones who pass judgment on Jesus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The apostles in the book of Acts. But I want to stress that the division between the Pharisees and the Sadducees simply becomes more and more and more pronounced. It becomes more and more bitter. There is a story at the end of Acts, if you remember, chapter 22 or 3, where Paul is brought before the Sanhedrin, and, they're trying him for violations of the law, etc. They're eventually going to, send him to Rome because they want to kill him. And there's actually an assassination plot to kill Paul, remember? But he appeals to Rome, and they can't get rid of him. They want to kill him, but he appeals to Rome and eventually goes there to present his case. And tradition says that he won that case and was, released from prison, but then he got in trouble, put back in prison, and Nero executed him. But the Sanhedrin Council, when Paul is before them in the book of Acts, he basically pulls this dirty little trick. Like, Paul, that was just dirty. That was just really, really dirty, and you need to repent, dirty. He basically gets them to start fighting amongst themselves by mentioning the resurrection. He knows what the powder keg, lightning hot, issue of the day is. He knows how he can get the focus off himself and get them to start squabbling with each other, and it becomes this, fisticuffs free-for-all, not really. But the book of Acts says that they all just started fighting amongst themselves because he had mentioned the resurrection. It's like, he knows the hot word to say, and suddenly everybody's focused on each other and how much they hate the other side and not Paul. The only thing they were really unified in is they hated Jesus and they hated Paul. So again, we see the Jewish Senate, which has existed all of this time. We see the Jewish Senate evolve into what we now know as the Sanhedrin during this particular period. Any comments or questions about anything we've talked about? Okay. A split forms in the Hasmonean Dynasty when Alexander is the Hasmonean we left off with last week. He's not a very good ruler. In fact, he is very controversial. A lot of Jews hate him. He's really focused on a lot of fighting. His wife is Alexandra, also known as Salome, and she's pretty good, but she's raising two sons kind of later in her life. And so she's not really political for a long time. But when Alexander dies after reigning for about 25 years, remember, he started when he was about 25. He's only in his early 50s when he passes away. He bequeaths the kingdom to his queen, right? And she rules for about 7 years before she dies in her 60s. Okay, and that's when, Salome is from a very prestigious Pharisaical family. So it's under her reign that the Pharisees suddenly become incredibly powerful. And the Sadducees are marginalized. They don't like that. Remember, the Sadducees are the pragmatic politicians, and they want to control the power. Even though they're the priestly class, they're not as religious as you might want them to be. They're very progressive. The Sadducees have really turned loose of the promises that God made about David, and they're like, oh, those were promises, nearly 1,000 years ago, and we're living in a new age, and we just need to do what's best for the nation. The Pharisees are the ultra conservatives. The Pharisees are wanting to make their oral law the law of the land, and they succeed in doing so to a large degree. They are very popular with the people. These are laity individuals. The Sadducees, they're more of the clergy, if you will. But the Pharisees are very, very powerful during this period. And after Alexandra Salome dies, she puts her two sons kind of jointly in charge. And instead of playing nice with each other, I'm sure she dressed them in matching outfits throughout their whole lives. Instead of playing nice with each other, they can't stand each other, and there's civil war that kind of happens between the two of them. Now, one of them is named John Hyrcanus II, after his grandfather. The second one is Aristobulus, or Aristobulus, however you pronounce it. And they don't get along. Aristobulus is very popular with the Sadducees. Hyrcanus is popular with the Pharisees. But you got a lot of things going on. And they just fight and fight and fight and fight. In fact, it comes down, this is in the year 64 BC. Aristobulus and some Sadducees and priests are holed up in the temple. John Hyrcanus had been forced out of Jerusalem by his brother, and swore an oath that he would abandon all of his claims to rule and everything. Only he goes and gets the Idumeans under Antipater to mass an army and come back to Jerusalem to try and unseat his brother. His brother and the Pharisees the Sadducees and priests are holed up in the temple, 64 BC. This is during Passover, I believe. And he's got the people on his side, sort of kind of Hyrcanus does. He's got Jerusalem. He just doesn't have the temple fortress, complex. That's where his brother's holed up. And he's trying to gain more, popularity with the people. Aristobulus is like, okay, well, we need animals for the sacrifices. And he kind of puts his brother in a bind, and he's like, well, okay, we'll give you the animals, but it's for an exorbitant price, thinking his brother will never pay that kind of money for the necessary animals to sacrifice for Passover. But then he does pony up the dough. And finally, he decides, I'm not going to give you the animals. And that's kind of when there's like this mass revolt against John Hyrcanus II. A year later, though, this whole time, Rome's been gaining more and more power. They've pretty much swallowed up the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucid Empire is gone. In fact, it had kind of died and was now a corpse. But Pompey, the Roman general, is the one that buried the body, so to speak. And so he comes to Jerusalem because why not? He's just taking more and more territory. And a year after that, confrontation in Jerusalem at Passover, he just walks into Jerusalem, takes it over, and enters the most holy place. Notices that there's nothing there. This first historical record that there's nothing in the most holy place, i.e. the Ark of the Covenant is gone. And from then on, Rome's in charge. So we're going to look at some videos about that particular period. So any comments or questions on any of that? That's kind of an overview of what we're going to be looking at tonight. Oh, okay, so let me move this. First of all, this is, here we go. This is a really good book. If it comes up, here we go. Yeah, I don't know if how many of you have read the book "Killing Jesus" by,
I did.
Yeah, by Bill O'Reilly.
Yeah.
I think I've recommended it before. The reason I'm recommending it, though, this is a whole series, the Killing series: killing Reagan, killing Lincoln, killing Kennedy, killing a whole bunch of people. This goes into the political background behind the crucifixion of Jesus, and it goes all the way to Julius Caesar taking power over Rome. Little did we know that in 44 BC, when Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon and ends the Roman Republic, that chain of events would coalesce into the crucifixion of the Son of God, but that's exactly what happened. And if you really want to see the development of Rome being in charge of the Holy Land and that culminating in the death of Jesus, this is a great book that kind of traces that all the way down to the crucifixion itself. That's a really, really good book. What were your thoughts on it, Linda?
Well, I read it quite a while ago. I'd have to review it again. But yeah, I thought it was really well done.
Okay.
And it was an easy read and easy to follow.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. So we're going to watch this, and let's see if I can get it to work. All right. So quick recap. Alexander, who started reigning, he was the first one to take on the title as king and high priest, and he ended up being a disaster. He stayed ruling, sort of, but you saw he lost any sway with the people, and the Pharisees gained more and more and more control. The Pharisees, fleeing and those 800 being crucified, that gave them even more credibility with the people. Can y'all understand that? The people's sympathies were with the Pharisees, and that continues into the first century. The Pharisees are very popular with the people, and the split grows. The Sadducees, their influence is certainly diminished. And when Alexandra Salome was a good queen. In fact, she's only the second queen to rule over Israel, the first being Queen Athaliah in 2 Kings, in the book of 2 Kings. She was a good queen. She was very loved by her people. In fact, by the time you get to the first century, Mary, or Miriam, is the number one most common name for a Jewish girl. And 2 is Salome, and we meet some in the New Testament. So Mary and Salome are the 2 most popular girl names among Jews when you get to the first century. And her 2 sons end up just making a mess of everything, and Rome comes in, and that's where we're going to pick up. Okay, what's happening here? Great. Okay, so I want to point out that during this entire period that we just covered, did you see how much people in Judea, powers that be, are appealing outside of Judaism for help to settle squabbles, hiring mercenary armies? Okay, that whole thing about why are you running down to Egypt to be bailed out? This has continued to be a bigger and bigger problem, and the fact that you have these factions, developing. John Hyrcanus II and his brother Aristobulus, they just can't get together. One has to wonder how much of this was in the back of Jesus' mind when he made the statement, "A house divided itself will never stand." That's said in the context of the Pharisees accusing Jesus that his power to work miracles was really the power of Satan. But I think that Jesus uses that metaphor because his listeners would have thought, "Oh yeah, that hasn't worked out." When you've got inner strife, okay, when you've got division in the house instead of a unified front, then it's just going to eventually collapse. It's going to destabilize and it's going to collapse. And so that's something you see throughout this period. The other thing that I wanted to mention here at the end is that, have you ever wondered why Herod, in the story of Jesus, is King Herod, but the Romans are in charge? What's going on? Okay? And by the time you get to the crucifixion of Jesus, it's King Herod, but Pontius Pilate, who's the governor from the Romans. What's going on? Who's got what power? Okay? Herod, I can't remember. I think if the one that there are several Herods in the New Testament. Of course, Herod the Great is the one that's king when Jesus is born. There's Herod the Tetrarch, Herod Antipas. I can't remember which one, though, is king when he's crucified off the top of my head. However, he's kind of a Jew, because remember we talked about last week, the Idumeans, they've kind of converted to Judaism. They've had circumcision forced on them, but they're not fully Jewish because they're actually Edomite. Okay? So Herod's a Jew, but not really, and certainly not really religiously, kind of, okay? For show, but he is recognized as the king, except he just doesn't have sovereign power, but he's recognized the king, just as Alexander had been king and the previous Hasmonean rulers had had a king-like authority. Herod is king, but it's at the will of the Roman Empire. So he's got some power, but it's kept in check by Rome. He's Rome's lackey. And in addition to his kingship, you have a Roman governor of the area who, in the time of Jesus' ministry, is Pontius Pilate. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? That's why you have Pilate, the governor, but also you have King Herod in the Gospels, and it descends from what we just talked about. Herod the Great, who is king when Jesus is born, he's the one that kills all the babies in Jerusalem or in Bethlehem. His father was Antipater that we just heard about in that video. So hopefully you're kind of seeing more and more of the details of the New Testament story kind of crystallize as we get nearer and nearer to the turn of the first century. Okay? Comments or questions about any of this? John?
Yeah, I know I missed several sections here. So at what point does the Judea start having kings again?
Okay, yeah, so that's a multi-layered answer, and the best way I know to answer it is they have been ruled by either the Ptolemies in Egypt or the Seleucids in Syria until about 165 BC. That's when Judas Maccabeus, the Maccabean revolt, kind of shoved off that power, and they more or less begin to rule independently. Now here's the key. The Hasmonean rulers were high priests, they ran the military, and they held a lot of civic authority. So they function as a king, but no one gives them the title of king, and they don't take the title of king for themselves because they don't think that's proper. The Hasmoneans, the Maccabeans, they were Levites. They're not from Judah, so they're not going to start claiming themselves king because they know that the kingship still rests with the tribe of Judah in the Davidic line. Alexander Jannaeus, that we met at the beginning of the first video around 103 BC, he's like the grandson of the original Maccabeans that led the revolt. He's the first one to actually take the title of king. And that starts a whole mess of problems. Alexandra, his wife, becomes queen when he dies. And then their son, John Hyrcanus II, becomes king. But it's getting to the point where that title doesn't have any meaning anymore. And so really starting, I would say, with John Hyrcanus II, king deserves an asterisk beside it because you don't have any real power at this point. Even with Alexander, who everybody hated, the one that crucified the 800 Pharisees, he didn't have any political power. He's leading the military, but he's almost been exiled away from Jerusalem because nobody can stand him, and the Sanhedrin basically takes over ruling. So, to answer all that, you've got three layers of who's in power over Judea and the Jews by the time you come to the close of the first century BC. You've got Rome, they're the top, the buck stops here. And then you've got Herod, Antipater, and then his son Herod, who are kind of token kings, and they have some authority, but they still answer to Rome. They are what we call historically, they're client kings. They are ruling on Rome's behalf, sort of. You've got the governor, and there's actually a change somewhere around the time of Jesus where the Roman governor is introduced to the picture. When things started with Rome, in 64, they didn't have a governor. But the Herods are kind of the token kings, the client kings, and they have some power. But then below them, you've got the Sanhedrin. And they're the ones that are most powerful with the people. They're the ones who handle judicial things. You'll notice in the Gospels, Herod and Pilate are both, y'all are Jews, y'all settle this among yourselves. Don't bring this mess to us. We got bigger important things. This is a inter-Jewish squabble. Y'all settle this. But the Sanhedrin doesn't have the power to enforce the death penalty. So that's why they need Herod or Pilate to sign off on the crucifixion. Herod doesn't want anything to do with it because he's still sort of seen as the king of the Jews, and he doesn't want that on his hands, so he sends it to Pilate. He kicks it over to Pilate. Pilate doesn't want anything to do with it, so he does what? He literally washes his hands. I don't know if that was a saying in Roman culture already, or if that phrase literally comes from what he did then. My suspicion is that became a phrase after Pilate did it in the Gospels. But even Pilate says, look, y'all go do what you want, but this is without the authority of Rome. We're just going to turn a blind eye while you illicitly crucify this guy. That's Pontius Pilate's basic answer. Rome is not going to sanction this, but we're going to look the other way while y'all do what you want. And they're like, okay, well, Rome's not going to complain that we usurp their authority. So Rome is technically crucifying the two thieves, insurrectionists, on either side of Jesus. And while as Roman soldiers crucifying Jesus themselves, the Gospels make clear the power, the political power that's really crucifying Jesus, and it's the Jewish leaders in cahoots with the Romans, or at least with the blind eye of the Romans. Okay, so there's three levels of who's ruling Judea. Again, Rome, the Herods, and then the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin basically functions as the Jewish Supreme Court, but they don't have any capital punishment power. Very good question. What else?
Now, the Herod dynasty, basically they're working for Rome, aren't they? They were kind of put there to make sure that there was order, and also that they paid Rome their taxes. And,
yes.
And so that's the whole Herodian dynasty. And the Sadducees kind of promoted, they kind of worked for the Herodian dynasty, and they were the ones really in charge of the Sanhedrin. Mm-hmm. So really, that big Jewish court indirectly was really ruled by Rome, right? So it was
again, you've got Caiaphas the high priest in John 12 saying it's better that one man die for the entire nation than for the nation to be destroyed. He's the high priest, and it's politically expedient for the Sadducees and the Pharisees, because the Pharisees didn't like Jesus either. That's another thing that brought them together. See, Jesus brings people together. That's how they coalesce and conspire to kill Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of like it started out as a religious revolt, but it ended up being very political. So that's where.
I want us to pause and sit with that statement that Linda just made. It started out religious, but it became political. That'll preach. Okay, continue, Linda. Thank you.
No.
That was a little volleyball she served up for me to spike over the net.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get it all straight in my head, because there is a lot here, and I don't know all the details. I'm just trying to get a basic overview of it, of how you can see when Jesus kind of enters this big mess. You can see, the turmoil there in Judea and what Jesus had to deal with. Mm-hmm. Because it's amazing that God was able to work with that big mess. And
No, not just, you're right, but not just work with, he's the one pulling the strings all along.
And it's such a mess. It's almost you can go dizzy trying to figure out how all this is working together.
And I want to pause here. Think about that. He's not just working with it, he's pulling the strings to make it all happen. And that gives us hope today and at any point in the future, and it gives hope to our descendants and those who come after us. Regardless how much of a mess national or international politics become, we know that God's not just working with it. He's the one pulling the strings the entire time to accomplish his plan. And that's why in faith we can pray, Lord, I have no idea what you're doing right now, but there's one thing I'm convinced of, and that's you are in complete control, that you are working everything according to your plan. The heart of the king is like water in the hands of the Lord. He turns it whatever way he wills. Proverbs 21:1. Yeah. So, Let's back up for just a moment. We're getting close to the end of our time, but let's back up a moment. Let's widen our focus. Rome is not in the micromanagement business. They have no desire to micromanage all of their provinces and territories and protectorates and everything else. Their ideal is for them to rule themselves with a ethnarch, and that's what Herod was. Ethnarch is basically a ethnic king, a local king that is part of the people, not a Roman lackey, or not a Roman, not a Roman, an Italian. They want a local guy as king, but he's a puppet king, but he's king. They want a local guy. And they have a governor in some of these places just to make sure Rome's interests are being served as the boot on the ground. But they don't want to micromanage anything. Their ideal situation is to have a local king that's of the people. Okay, so they create the aura of, well, we're kind of in charge, but y'all are free to rule yourselves. And do things as y'all see fit, as long as you serve us and don't, cause problems. That's kind of Rome's way. Does that make sense? You kind of get to rule yourselves and do what you want and forge your own destiny, as long as it's also our destiny that serves our destiny. And so I want you to see Herod as the Herods as the bridge between Rome and the Sanhedrin. Rome, completely Gentile. Sanhedrin, completely Jewish. And so in the Herods, you have a Jewish king that's making sure that Rome's interests are being served and that Rome is satisfied. Okay? And you will have Herods that are king of Palestine up until the Jewish revolt that ends with the temple destroyed in AD 70. Okay? Hopefully that kind of crystallizes things and why they are the way they are politically by the time you get to the New Testament. And that's why I want to mention again Bill O'Reilly's book, Killing Jesus. I don't know if it's because I've got a degree in political science or for some other reason, but I've always been fascinated by what's going on politically, socially, and culturally behind the text of the Bible. Because, at least for me, it helps illuminate a lot of things. When you kind of understand what's going on politically behind the scenes, there's a lot of things that make sense, okay? So, yeah.
And the other thing, didn't Rome do this because Judea, they were on the far outskirts of the Roman territory. Weren't they really nervous of the Parthians because they were way out there? And
Someone did their homework.
And it's a little bit of a bumper ground there, so they needed something because it's on the far out reaches of Rome's territory, so that they can kind of have control without having to have massive Roman armies out there.
Well, once again, Linda's taking away my lesson for next week, so we're just going to come and pray and sing Kumbaya next week. No, I'm just kidding. I'm really impressed, Linda. You've come to class for years and just not prepared at all. But finally tonight, you got your act together. You're absolutely right. So that's another thing we'll talk more about next week. But for really their entire time being involved in Palestine at all, the Romans were never really able to move their empire any further east. Because the Parthians, which are the Persians, the Parthians are on their eastern frontier and constantly causing problems. And Rome needed Syria and Judea and that whole area, the Syrian Levant, Syro-Palestine. They needed that area to be secure and, wholly on our side, not causing problems, because when you've got trouble internally on your frontier and you've got trouble externally on the same frontier, that's just a big old mess. And if we can shore up things and have iron-tight control on our side of that frontier, then we're a little bit better able to rebuff attacks from the Parthians. That's why Rome takes such a huge interest in the Jews and in Palestine. They're always fighting wars on their frontiers. Julius Caesar's fighting in the British Isles. When he comes back, he was in Britain, right? Uh-huh. Yeah. So Rome's constantly doing that, fighting wars on their frontiers. But Judea is one of those frontiers, We kind of had this image that they just ruled the whole known world, and that's not true. Do you remember me saying that Alexander's empire was technically much larger than Rome's ever was? Remember that Alexander stretched all the way to India? Rome never came close to getting anywhere in breathing distance of India, not even close, okay? So Rome geographically never ruled as much territory as Alexander did at his height right before he died. Yeah. Also, fun fact that interested only me, Alexander Jannaeus, the king that we started out with tonight, he dies in his early mid-50s from alcoholism. Don't know why I found that interesting, but I find that interesting. And that's when his wife, who was 11 years older, Alexandra Salome, that's when she became a queen. Were these videos tonight helpful for y'all? I felt they did a little bit better explaining the events that went on, maybe better than I could off the top of my head. But hopefully these were helpful. Again, I am not expecting you to remember all of the history. Okay, I'm a nut for history, ask my mother, and I can't remember all of these details. What I want you to remember, though, as we think about what we've learned, we've seen the split between the Sadducees and Pharisees become even sharper and deeper. We've seen how the Sanhedrin has evolved. We've seen how king has been robbed of its real power as Rome took over. And we're seeing how the Herods become the bridge between the Roman Empire and the Sanhedrin and the rest of the Jewish nation. Okay? All right, let's close in a word of prayer. Father, as we study this period, just on the brink of the beginning of the New Testament story, help us to once again ponder how wonderful it is that it was in the fullness of time when you had made everything perfect. You brought your Son into the world. And may that alone, not just because of your sovereignty and power, but maybe that historical proof, give us hope and deepen our faith in turbulent times in our own day. To recognize that you're not just working with whatever happens, but you're the one orchestrating things from behind the scenes, that you're pulling the strings as the puppet master. You are the one who is large and in charge. And that even though it may not seem like it at times, everything in heaven and earth is going according to your plan to unite all things in your Son. Father, I pray that indeed that will help deepen our faith, deepen our ability to trust you in difficult times. Father, we're grateful that you brought your Son into the world for the salvation of the world. And Father, may we cling to that as our ultimate hope. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.